He thought she was just background noise, another tired waitress moving between crystal glasses and expensive suits, until her voice reached him and made 20 years of silence stand up inside his chest. Grace Monroe stood in the center aisle of Belladonna with a silver tray balanced against her hip, her fingers locked so tightly around the rim that the metal pressed pale half-moons into her dark skin. Around her, the private dining room glowed like a world she was allowed to enter only if she stayed invisible. Gold light spilled from chandeliers over marble floors. Red wine breathed in tall glasses. Men in tailored jackets laughed with the easy confidence of people who had never checked a grocery total twice before paying. Women in silk dresses watched the room through diamond flashes, their smiles polished, their kindness optional. Grace had learned how to move through places like this without disturbing the air. Eyes lowered, shoulders straight, voice soft, smile ready. Never too proud, never too tired, never too human. That was how you kept a job when rent was due in 9 days and your mother's prescription cost more than your electric bill. But tonight, invisibility was failing her. Derek Walsh, the floor manager, stood beside the grand piano with his arms folded, his face tight with the satisfaction of having an audience. "Grace," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to turn. "Since you enjoy making yourself heard in the kitchen, maybe you can apologize to Miss Bell for interrupting a professional rehearsal." A few guests chuckled before they even understood the joke. Clara Bell, the evening's hired singer, leaned against the piano in a silver dress that caught every candle flame. She looked Grace up and down as if inspecting a stain on linen. "It's adorable, really," Clara said. "Some people hear a few notes and start believing they belong near a stage." Grace felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she did not let it reach her face. She had been carrying plates for 10 hours. Her black shoes pinched at the toes. A coffee burn marked her wrist from the morning shift. And still, somehow, the worst pain came from standing under all that beautiful light while strangers decided she was small. At the far end of the room, Vincent Callahan sat alone in a corner booth, half-shadowed behind a glass of untouched bourbon. No one in the dining room knew he owned Belladonna through 3 quiet companies, and one older, named Nobody, said unless they had to. He had come without warning, without bodyguards at the table, without the usual announcement that made managers straighten their ties and employees pretend dignity was company policy. Vincent watched Derek smile. He watched Clara tilt her chin. He watched Grace inhale once, slowly, the way a person does when swallowing words that might cost her everything. At first, he told himself not to interfere. A room shows its soul only when it thinks power is not watching. Then Grace opened her mouth to apologize, and instead of an apology, one trembling note slipped out, low and clear, barely more than breath, but shaped with such aching beauty that the laughter died before it reached the walls. Vincent's hand froze around his glass. The note became a phrase in Old Italian, soft as a prayer, familiar as a hand on a child's forehead. The color drained from his face. It was impossible. No one sang that song anymore. No one outside his family even knew it existed. The last person Vincent had heard sing it was his mother, Evelyn Callahan, on a rainy night when he was 8 years old, before the world taught him to lock every gentle thing behind stone. Grace stopped as soon as she realized sound had escaped her. The room had gone still. Forks hovered above plates. Derek's smirk thinned into confusion. Clara's diamonds trembled at her throat. Vincent stood slowly, and the chair beneath him whispered against the marble like a warning. Every eye turned toward him, but his eyes never left Grace. For the first time that night, someone in that room looked at her not as a uniform, not as a pair of hands, not as a mistake to be corrected, but as a locked door that had just opened. His voice came quiet, controlled, and cold enough to make the candles seem smaller. "Where did you learn that song?" Grace did not answer right away. The question seemed to hang above the dining room, suspended between the chandeliers and the silent guests, too heavy for anyone else to touch. She could feel Derek staring at her from beside the piano, his warning sharp without a single word. She could feel Clara Bell's smile hardening into something brittle. But Vincent Callahan's eyes held her in place. They were not soft eyes. They were the kind of eyes that had made grown men lower their voices across boardrooms and backrooms all over Chicago. Yet beneath the coldness, Grace saw something she had not expected. Recognition, not of her face, not of her uniform, but of the pain wrapped inside that song. My mother taught it to me, Grace said finally, her voice steady only because breaking would have given Derek too much satisfaction. Her name is Lillian Monroe. The name did not appear to mean anything to the room. A woman at table 4 adjusted her bracelet. A man near the window cleared his throat, impatient for the evening to return to its expensive rhythm. But Vincent did not move. His jaw tightened once, almost invisibly. "And where did your mother learn it?" he asked. Grace looked down at the tray in her hands. 6 hours earlier, she had been standing in the employee locker room, tying an apron around her waist, telling herself to survive one more double shift. Belladonna was the kind of restaurant that made ordinary people whisper when they passed the windows. The front doors were brass. The hostess stand was black walnut. The wine cellar below the kitchen held bottles worth more than Grace's car, a 12-year-old sedan with a cracked passenger mirror and a heater that only worked when the engine felt generous. She had been working there for 8 months, long enough to know which guests tipped with kindness and which ones used money like permission to be cruel. Derek had hired her because she was efficient, quiet, and desperate. He liked all 3 qualities in an employee. He especially liked reminding her that there were a dozen girls waiting for her job if she forgot her place. Grace never forgot. She needed every paycheck. Her mother's small apartment on the south side smelled faintly of lavender soap and prescription ointment, and every Friday Grace left cash in a blue envelope beneath the sugar jar because Lillian was too proud to take it directly. Lillian Monroe had once been a nurse with hands steady enough to comfort crying babies and stubborn old men who claimed they were not scared. Now her lungs tired after a walk from the bedroom to the kitchen, and Grace had become the one who counted pills, argued with insurance offices, and smiled through exhaustion so her mother would not worry. Music had been the first thing Grace gave up when life demanded a sacrifice. Not all at once. First it was fewer lessons. Then she deferred her place at a conservatory in New York. Then she sold the black dress she had bought for auditions. Finally, she stopped singing where anyone could hear. Except sometimes, when the kitchen noise covered her voice and the ache in her chest needed somewhere to go, she hummed the old Italian lullaby her mother used to sing while braiding her hair. That afternoon, during rehearsal, Clarabelle had missed the same phrase 3 times. The band leader winced, but said nothing. Grace, passing with a tray of polished water glasses, had murmured the correct line without thinking. Clara heard it. Derek heard Clara complain. And by dinner service, Grace had already been marked as a problem. Now she stood before the wealthiest people in the city, being questioned by a man whose silence frightened them more than shouting ever could. "My mother worked private care many years ago," Grace said. She cared for a woman who sang it when she could not sleep. Vincent's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with memory. "What woman?" Grace swallowed. "She never told me her full name. Only Evelyn." The name moved through Vincent like a door opening in a house he had abandoned. His glass sat forgotten on the table behind him. The candles flickered, and for the first time since Grace had walked into Belladonna, Derek Walsh looked afraid. Vincent repeated the name only in his mind, because saying it aloud would have given the room too much access to something private. Evelyn. For 20 years, that name had lived behind locked doors, inside old photographs, unopened boxes, and the kind of grief powerful men pretend they have outgrown. He looked at Grace Monroe again, really looked at her now, past the black uniform, past the tray, past the tired shoes and the careful posture of a woman who had learned to make herself smaller for the comfort of others. There was no performance in her face, no hunger for attention, no calculation, just confusion, fear, and a quiet dignity that made the room's earlier laughter feel even uglier in hindsight. Derek stepped forward too quickly, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. "Mr. Callahan, I am so sorry for this interruption," he said, forcing a nervous smile. Grace has a habit of forgetting boundaries. She is a good worker when supervised, but sometimes staff members misunderstand the tone of a private event. The words landed softly, but everyone understood their shape. He was trying to put her back in her place. Grace's fingers tightened around the tray again. She knew that tone. It was the voice used by people who never shouted because they had learned how to humiliate politely. Clara gave a light laugh and lifted one hand as if smoothing the air. "Honestly, Vincent, it is nothing dramatic. She heard me rehearse earlier and decided to show off. It happens. People get inspired by proximity." A few guests smiled carefully, waiting to see which side Power would choose. Vincent did not look at Clara. He kept his eyes on Derek. When did she interrupt your rehearsal? Derek blinked. Excuse me. You said she interrupted it. I asked when. The room grew tighter. The band leader lowered his gaze toward the piano keys. A server near the wall stopped breathing for a second. Derek swallowed. Around 5 o'clock, maybe. We were preparing the final set. Vincent turned his head slightly toward the band leader. Is that what happened? The man behind the piano was named Harold Pierce, 62 years old, with silver hair and hands that still trembled before every performance despite 40 years of playing professionally. He looked at Derek, then at Grace, then at the black and white keys in front of him. The truth sat in his throat like a stone. No, sir, Harold said quietly. Clara's smile disappeared. Derek's face went still. Harold lifted his eyes. Miss Bell missed the bridge 3 times. Miss Monroe passed by and sang the correct line under her breath. She was not trying to be heard. She was right. Silence moved across the room like spilled ink. Grace stared at Harold, startled by the small act of courage. It was not much, only a sentence, but sometimes a sentence is enough to change the weather. Clara's cheeks flushed beneath her makeup. That is absurd, she said. I was warming up. You were flat, Harold replied, almost apologetically. Vincent finally looked at Clara, and the weight of that look made her straighten. And after that, he asked. No one answered at first. From the kitchen doors came the faint clatter of dishes and the soft hiss of steam, ordinary sounds continuing while the dining room stood on the edge of something irreversible. Grace wanted to disappear. She wanted to protect her job, her mother's medicine, the rent envelope taped behind the loose panel in her closet. But she also felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Not pride exactly, not anger, but the tired ache of a person who had bent for too long and had finally hurt a bone inside her spirit refuse. After that, Grace said, her voice low, Miss Bell told Mr. Walsh I made her uncomfortable. Mr. Walsh told me to stay away from the stage, the piano, and the guests unless I was carrying something. Derek turned sharply. Grace. Vincent's voice cut through his. Let her finish. The words were not loud, but they closed every mouth in the room. Grace lifted her chin. Then a guest spilled wine near table 6, and Miss Bell said I had done it. I had not. Mr. Walsh told me to clean it in front of everyone and apologize because the restaurant could not afford to embarrass important people. She paused, and her eyes moved across the tables where some of those important people suddenly found their napkins fascinating. So I apologized. Vincent's expression did not change, but something colder entered the room. He understood business. He understood loyalty. He even understood fear. But cruelty dressed as management disgusted him more than open disrespect ever had. He turned toward Derek. My restaurant, he said slowly, does not require innocent people to apologize for the comfort of liars. Derek's mouth opened, but no sound came. Clara looked toward the exit as if the brass doors had moved farther away. Grace stood beneath the chandelier with the tray still in her hands, but the room was no longer looking through her. They were looking at her, and for the first time all night, she did not lower her eyes. The word restaurant seemed to strike Derek harder than any accusation. His eyes darted toward the guests, then toward the staff lined along the walls, then back to Vincent Callahan, whose quiet presence had become the center of the room without asking for permission. Your restaurant, Derek repeated, barely above a whisper. Vincent did not answer him. He did not need to. The people who mattered already understood. A few of the regular guests shifted in their chairs, suddenly reviewing every careless word they had ever spoken under Belladonna's chandeliers. Clara Bell went very still beside the piano, one hand resting on its polished black surface as if she needed something solid to keep her standing. Grace felt the tray grow heavier against her palms. For 8 months, she had believed Derek owned her hours, her voice, her smile, the way she moved through the dining room, the amount of space she was allowed to take. Now she realized he had only borrowed power from a building that had never truly belonged to him. Vincent stepped away from his table and crossed the marble floor with the unhurried pace of a man who knew no one would stop him. The candlelight caught the silver at his temples. His suit was dark, simple, perfect. He stopped a few feet from Grace, not close enough to frighten her, but close enough that she could see the controlled tension in his face. You said your mother cared for Evelyn, he said. Grace nodded. A long time ago. Before I was born. Did she ever tell you where? Grace swallowed. The answer had always sounded like a secret too large for her life. A house near Lake Forest. White stone. Green shutters. A garden with a broken fountain. Vincent closed his eyes for 1 second. Only one. But in that second, the room saw something human pass across his face before he locked it away again. When he opened his eyes, his voice had lost a fraction of its ice. That was my mother's house. The words reached Grace slowly. She stared at him, and for the first time, the distance between waitress and owner, worker and wealthy man, invisible woman and feared name, seemed to bend under the weight of something older than either of them. Lillian had never told her much about Evelyn. Only fragments. A kind woman with tired eyes. A woman who sang when pain kept her awake. A woman who pressed a cassette tape into Lillian's hand and said, "If my son ever forgets softness, let the song find him." Grace had thought it was one of her mother's poetic memories, the kind older people keep polished because the truth is too sharp. But Vincent's face told her it had been real. Clara's voice cut into the silence, too bright, too desperate. "This is touching, really, but we have a room full of paying guests. Maybe this family history can wait until after my performance." Harold Pierce looked down at the piano keys as if embarrassed for her. Derek seized the chance. "Exactly. Mr. Callahan, I can handle this privately. Grace can return to the kitchen. Miss Bell can continue, and no one has to make a scene." Vincent turned toward him. A scene was already made. Derek forced a smile. "With respect, sir, the scene began when an employee forgot professionalism." Grace flinched before she could stop herself. Vincent noticed. So did everyone else. That tiny movement, that trained expectation of blame, told him more about Belladonna's management than any report ever could. He looked toward the hostess stand near the entrance. "Bring me the staff tablet." A young hostess named Emily hesitated only a moment before hurrying over with the device. Her hands shook as she placed it in Vincent's palm. Derek's face changed. "Sir, the floor system is not necessary. I decide what is necessary." Vincent tapped the screen and opened the internal service log, the one managers use to track complaints, shift changes, tip adjustments, and disciplinary notes. Grace's stomach dropped. She had never seen that file, but she knew Derek loved records when records could be used as chains. Vincent scrolled once. Then again. His expression darkened. 3 written warnings for speaking near the entertainment area, he read. 2 deductions from tip pool for attitude. 1 unpaid extra hour after a guest complaint that was never documented. The staff along the wall exchanged glances. Grace felt heat rise in her throat. She had wondered why her check had been short. Derek opened his mouth, but Vincent lifted one finger, and the room froze. "Grace Monroe," he said, still looking at the screen, "has the highest guest satisfaction notes of any server on this floor." He looked up slowly, and the lowest tip payout percentage. The silence changed. It was no longer shock. It was judgment. Derek's polished confidence began to crack at the edges. Grace stood motionless beneath the chandelier, the old song still trembling somewhere behind her ribs, while Vincent Callahan finally saw not just the voice that had reached him, but the system that had tried to bury it. Grace had spent 8 months believing exhaustion was normal. She had believed the missing dollars in her paycheck were mistakes too small to question. The extra minutes after closing were part of proving herself, and the sharp comments tucked inside Derek Walsh's smile were just another cost of working in a room where people measured worth by the label inside a jacket. But as Vincent Callahan held the staff tablet beneath the chandelier light, every small indignity began to gather shape. Not one large wound, but 100 paper cuts, neatly filed, politely named, and hidden behind words like policy, attitude, and professionalism. Vincent scrolled through the records without hurry. That made it worse for Derek. A loud man could be dismissed as angry. A quiet man reading carefully was something else. It was judgment learning the facts before it spoke. "Miss Monroe worked 49 hours last week," Vincent said. "Paid for 37. Derek wet his lips. "There are break deductions, sir, and service penalties when standards are not met." Vincent looked up. "She has 5 customer compliments from that same week." The room was so quiet Grace could hear the ice settling inside a glass near table 2. Vincent continued. "A guest wrote, 'Grace made our anniversary feel personal.' Another wrote, 'Best service in Chicago.' Another wrote, She remembered my daughter's allergy before we ordered dessert. He lowered the tablet slightly. What standard did she fail? Derek's face reddened. Tone. Presence. There have been concerns about attitude. Grace almost laughed, but it would have come out too broken. Attitude. That was what they called it when she did not shrink quickly enough. Presence. That was what they called it when her humanity took up space. Clara folded her arms, trying to reclaim the room with impatience. This is becoming uncomfortable. Vincent turned his eyes to her. Good. One word. The room went still again. Clara blinked as if no one had ever spoken to her with so little interest in her comfort. Vincent handed the tablet back to Emily, then faced the staff gathered along the wall. Who else has had tips withheld? No one moved. Grace knew that silence. It was the silence of rent, children, gas bills, medical debt, and the fear of being replaced by mourning. Vincent waited. He did not soften the question, and he did not rush it. Finally, a busboy named Marcus raised his hand halfway. Then Emily. Then a dishwasher visible through the kitchen window. Then 2 servers by the wine station. Hands rose one by one, reluctant and shaking, until Derek seemed to stand alone in a room full of witnesses. Grace looked at them, stunned. For months they had suffered separately, each believing the unfairness belonged only to them. Now the truth had stepped into the light and found company. Derek gave a strained laugh. This is absurd. They are taking advantage of the moment because they think there will be money in it. Vincent stepped closer to him, not threatening, not hurried, simply close enough that Derek had to stop pretending he controlled the floor. No, Vincent said. They are telling the truth because, for once, you are not the loudest man in the room. Harold Pierce let out a breath at the piano. Somewhere near the bar, a server wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. Grace held the tray against her waist like a shield, though she no longer knew what she was protecting herself from. The danger had shifted. It was no longer about being fired. It was about being seen so clearly that she could never return to being invisible. Vincent turned back to her. His voice changed when he spoke her name, not gentle exactly, but careful. Miss Monroe, did Mr. Walsh ask you to sing behind the curtain for Miss Bell tonight? Clara's posture snapped rigid. Derek's eyes widened. Grace felt every face swing toward her. The question opened a door she had been trying to keep closed, because humiliation was one thing, but admitting they had wanted to use her gift while hiding her face was something deeper. She looked at Clara, who suddenly appeared less like a star and more like a woman terrified of losing applause she had not earned. Grace looked at Derek, whose power had always depended on her silence. Then she looked at Vincent, and behind the cold eyes she saw a son still listening for his mother's song. Yes, Grace said. Her voice did not tremble this time. Miss Bell lost her voice during rehearsal. Mr. Walsh told me to stand behind the side curtain and sing the final number while she performed on stage. Clara snapped. That is not what happened. Harold's hands rested on the piano keys. It is exactly what happened. The words landed cleanly. No drama. No flourish. Just truth. Vincent turned toward the stage, where the velvet side curtain hung in deep red folds. For the first time, the room understood the cruelty completely. They had mocked Grace for having a voice, then planned to borrow that same voice as long as no one saw who it belonged to. Vincent looked at the curtain, then at Clara, then at Derek. You wanted her sound, he said quietly, but not her name. Grace felt the sentence enter her chest and unlock something. She had not known how badly she needed someone else to say it. The chandelier light blurred for a second, but she did not cry. She simply stood taller. And in that shining room built to celebrate status, every person present began to understand that the woman holding the tray had carried more grace than all of them combined. Vincent let the sentence remain in the air until it did what truth often does when nobody rushes to cover it. It made the guilty uncomfortable. Clara Bell looked away first, her polished confidence thinning beneath the chandelier light. Derek Walsh tried to straighten his tie, but his fingers slipped once, and Grace saw the tremor. For 8 months, his voice had controlled schedules, sections, tip sheets, and quiet threats near the walk-in freezer. Now he looked smaller than the shadow behind him. Vincent turned toward the stage. Harold, he said. The pianist lifted his head. Yes, Mr. Callahan. Can you play the song she sang? Harold hesitated, then placed both hands on the keys. Only if Miss Monroe leads. I caught the melody, but not the soul of it. Grace's breath stopped. Every face in the room came back to her. The tray in her hands suddenly felt wrong, almost insulting, as if she were still holding proof that she belonged to service and not sound. Vincent noticed. He reached out, not touching her, only offering space. "May I take that?" he asked. The question was simple, but it moved through Grace with unexpected force. Men like Vincent Callahan did not usually ask. Derek had grabbed trays from her hands. Guests had snapped fingers at her. Clara had spoken around her as if she were furniture. But Vincent waited for permission. Grace looked down at the tray, then slowly handed it to him. He accepted it with both hands, as if it weighed more than silver. Then he turned and passed it to Emily without taking his eyes off Grace. "Only if you choose to," he said. The room seemed to lean toward her, hungry for a decision it had no right to demand. Grace thought of her mother in the small apartment on the south side, wrapped in a faded blue robe, humming between coughs while sorting orange prescription bottles on the kitchen table. She thought of the cassette tape in Lillian's dresser drawer, labeled in careful handwriting, "Evelyn, Rainy Night." She thought of being 18 years old, standing outside the conservatory in New York with an acceptance letter folded in her purse, telling herself she would return in 1 year, then 2, then someday, until someday became a locked room she stopped visiting. And she thought of the red curtain, where Derek had wanted her hidden like a secret while Clara wore the applause. Grace stepped toward the piano. Her shoes made almost no sound on the marble. Harold shifted on the bench, giving her the center. Clara let out a small, disbelieving breath. "This cannot be happening." Vincent answered without looking at her. "It already is." Grace stood beside the piano, not on the stage, not behind the curtain, but in plain view of every guest who had laughed, whispered, or looked through her. Her heart beat fast, but her voice, when it came, was steady. The first note rose soft and low, carrying the warmth of an old kitchen, the sadness of a woman remembered, and the dignity of every person who had ever been told to stay quiet. Harold found the chords beneath her, gentle and reverent. The Italian words filled belladonna slowly, touching the marble, the crystal, the folded napkins, the expensive watches resting on guilty wrists. Vincent stood motionless near the front table. His face did not break, but his eyes changed. He was no longer seeing a dining room. He was 8 years old again, sitting at the top of a staircase while rain tapped the windows and his mother sang from the room below. Grace did not know the memory she had opened. She only knew that the room had stopped judging her. By the final line, even the candles seemed still. No one clapped at first. Applause would have been too easy, too cheap, too late. The silence was deeper than approval. It was recognition. Grace lowered her gaze to the piano keys, and for one precious second, she did not feel like a waitress who had been allowed to sing. She felt like a voice that had finally returned to its own name. The silence after Grace's final note felt different from the silence before it. Before, the room had been holding its breath out of shock. Now it was holding its breath out of shame. Grace stood beside the piano with her hands folded at her waist, unsure what to do with herself now that there was no tray to carry, no spill to wipe, no apology to offer. Harold Pierce kept his fingers resting lightly on the keys, as if he feared any movement might disturb what her voice had left behind. Vincent Callahan did not speak for a long moment. His eyes remained fixed on Grace, but his mind had traveled somewhere far from belladonna, to a white stone house near Lake Forest, to green shutters, to rain on tall windows, to his mother's hand brushing dark hair from his forehead while she sang the same words in a voice thinner than Grace's, but carrying the same sorrow. When he finally moved, it was only to reach inside his suit jacket and remove a small leather card case. From it, he took an old photograph, worn at the edges from years of being carried and never shown. He walked to Grace and held it out. "Was this the woman your mother cared for?" Grace accepted the photograph carefully. A young Evelyn Callahan looked back from the faded image, seated at a garden table with flowers behind her and a softness in her eyes that made Grace's throat tighten. She had seen that face before, not in person, but in the cassette case her mother kept wrapped in a scarf at the bottom of her dresser. Grace nodded slowly. "Yes, that is her." Vincent looked down, and something in his expression shifted from grief into certainty. "Then your mother knew mine." Clara gave a short laugh, too sharp for the moment. A touching coincidence does not change the fact that this event has been completely disrupted. Nobody laughed with her. Even the guests who had once leaned toward Clara's confidence now leaned away from it. Vincent turned his head. "You still think this is about an event?" Clara's lips parted, but he had already looked past her toward Emily. "The private room camera. Put the last hour on the dining room screen." Derek stepped forward, color draining from his face. "Mr. Callahan, with respect, we cannot display internal footage in front of guests." Vincent's gaze settled on him. "You have mistaken embarrassment for privacy." Emily moved quickly to the host station. A large screen above the wine display, usually used for charity announcements and tasting menus, flickered to life. At first there was only a silent view of the dining room from above. Then the footage jumped backward. The guests watched themselves laughing while Grace knelt to clean the wine she had not spilled. They watched Derek lean down and speak close to her ear, his face smiling for the room while his words, captured by the staff tablet audio, came clear through the speakers. "Apologize now, or do not bother clocking in tomorrow." Grace closed her eyes. Hearing it again hurt more than she expected. Then the screen changed to the rehearsal area. Clara stood near the piano, pressing a hand to her throat. Derek paced beside her. Grace appeared in the background carrying folded napkins. Clara's recorded voice filled the room. "Let the waitress sing it from behind the curtain. Nobody has to know," Derek answered. "As long as she keeps her face out of sight, it saves the night." The room went cold. Not quiet. Cold. Grace opened her eyes and saw people staring at the screen with expressions that looked almost frightened, not of Vincent, but of themselves. They had been ready to admire a beautiful lie as long as it came dressed correctly. Vincent watched until the clip ended. Then he faced Clara and Derek. "You wanted her talent hidden, her labor discounted, her silence guaranteed, and her dignity optional." Derek whispered, "Sir, I can explain." "No," Vincent said. "You already did." The screen faded back to black. Grace stood beneath the chandelier, still and breathless, while every careless judgment in the room returned to its owner. For the first time in Belladonna's glittering history, the most powerful thing under its roof was not money, reputation, or fear. It was the truth, spoken in a waitress's voice. Vincent did not raise his voice. He did not need volume to make the room feel the weight of what had been done. He stood between the black screen and the people who had trusted silk, diamonds, and polished manners more than simple decency. Derek Walsh looked toward the exit, but two staff members were standing near the brass doors now, not blocking him, only watching him with the steady eyes of people who no longer feared his clipboard. Clara Bell touched her throat as if searching for the voice she had tried to borrow, but there was nothing in the room left for her to claim. Vincent turned to Emily. "Print every tip record from the last 12 months. Every adjustment, every penalty, every manager override." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "Yes, Mr. Callahan." Then he looked toward Marcus, the busboy whose hand had risen first. "You and the rest of the staff will be paid what you are owed by tomorrow afternoon. In full. With interest." Marcus stared at him as if the words had not reached him correctly. Grace saw his mouth tremble before he pressed it shut. Across the room, one of the older servers covered her face with both hands. It was not celebration yet. People who have been denied fairness too long do not believe in repair the first time they hear it promised. They wait for the catch. Vincent gave them none. He faced Derek. "Your employment ends tonight." Derek's expression twisted with panic. "Sir, please. I have worked here for 6 years. And in 6 years, you learned how to make good people feel replaceable." Vincent's voice remained calm. "That is not management. That is failure with a name tag." The sentence struck the room cleanly. Derek looked around for sympathy and found only mirrors. Every person who had laughed at Grace now had to decide whether they had laughed because they were cruel or because cruelty had been made convenient. Clara stepped forward, gathering what remained of her pride around her like a shawl. "You cannot treat me like this in front of everyone. My contract is with this establishment." Vincent looked at her with the same cold patience he had given the tablet. "Your contract required a live performance from you. Not deception. Not humiliation. Not a hidden singer behind a curtain." Clara's cheeks flushed. "My voice was strained. It happens to professionals." Harold Pierce spoke from the piano, gentle but firm. "Professionals do not steal another woman's voice and call it stagecraft." Clara stared at him, betrayed by the quietest man in the room. Vincent turned to the guests. "Dinner service is over. No bill will be presented tonight." Anyone who wishes to make a contribution may direct it to the staff relief fund that will be created before sunrise. A murmur moved through the tables, but no one protested. The room that had once paid to be entertained was now being asked to witness accountability, and it did not know where to place its hands. Grace stood near the piano, still unsure whether any of this truly belonged to her. Justice was happening around her, but she had spent so long surviving unfairness that fairness felt almost dangerous. Vincent seemed to understand. He walked back to her, stopping at a respectful distance. "Miss Monroe," he said, and the formality of it steadied her. "I owe you an apology." Grace blinked. "You do not owe me anything. I own the room where this happened." His eyes moved once across the marble floor, the chandeliers, the red velvet curtain. "That means I own the responsibility to see it sooner." The words did what money could not do. They did not erase the humiliation, but they refused to pretend it had been small. Grace's throat tightened. "I just wanted to do my job." "No," Vincent said softly. "You were doing more than your job. You were carrying dignity through a place that kept trying to take it from you." For the first time that night, Grace looked away not from fear, but because kindness, spoken plainly, was harder to hold than insult. Vincent turned slightly so the whole room could hear him. "Miss Monroe will decide what happens next. Not me. Not this restaurant. Not anyone who mistook her silence for permission." The power in that sentence was not that he defended her. It was that he handed the choice back. Grace looked at the stage, the curtain, the piano, the guests, the staff, the old photograph still resting in her hand. Then she lifted her chin, and the room waited, not for a performance, but for her answer. Grace held the photograph for a long moment, feeling the thin paper tremble slightly between her fingers. Evelyn Callahan's face looked back at her from another lifetime, gentle and tired, with the same quiet sorrow that had lived in her mother's stories. Around Grace, Belladonna waited. The guests waited. The staff waited. Vincent waited. No one pushed her. No one told her where to stand, what to say, how to smile, or when to disappear. That freedom should have felt light, but it felt enormous, like being handed back a part of herself she had forgotten how to carry. She looked toward the red velvet curtain where they had planned to hide her. Then she looked at the piano, where Harold's hands rested patiently, ready but not demanding. Finally, she looked at Vincent. "I do not want Clara's stage," Grace said. Clara flinched as if the sentence had taken something from her. But Grace was not speaking to wound her. That was the strange thing about dignity. Once you found it again, revenge started to look too small. "I do not want to be used to save a performance that never respected me. And I do not want anyone in this room to clap because they feel guilty." Her voice carried clearly now, not loud, not fragile, simply certain. "I want every person who worked tonight to be paid honestly. I want the kitchen staff included. I want Marcus and Emily and the dishwashers and the servers who were too scared to raise their hands. And I want my mother's name left out of gossip." Vincent nodded once, and no one in the room doubted that every word would be done. Grace lowered her eyes to the photograph again. "But I will sing one more song," she said. "Not for this party. Not for Miss Bell. Not for the people who laughed." She looked at Vincent, and something softened in her face. "For Evelyn. And for my mother, who carried her memory with kindness." Harold began to play before anyone could cheapen the moment with applause. The notes rose slowly, tender and unadorned, filling the room with the kind of beauty that did not ask permission from wealth. Grace sang with her eyes open this time. Her voice moved through the chandeliers and across the white tablecloths, past the guests who now sat with bowed heads, past Clara's silence, past Derek's empty place near the door, past every cruel thing that had been said beneath a polished smile. Vincent stood still, his hands folded in front of him, but the mask he had worn for half his life had cracked just enough for grief and gratitude to breathe through. He did not see a waitress. He did not see an employee. He saw the last echo of his mother's gentleness carried by a woman the world had tried to overlook. When the final note faded, no one moved. Then Marcus began to clap, once, twice, careful as if honoring something sacred. Emily joined him. Then Harold. Then the kitchen staff appeared in the doorway, their aprons dusted with flour, their faces shining beneath the fluorescent light. The applause grew, not wild, not hungry, but humble. Grace accepted it with tears in her eyes and her shoulders straight. Vincent waited until the room settled before speaking. Tomorrow, he said, Belladonna closes for 1 week. Every employee will be paid during that time. When it opens again, it opens with new management, transparent wages, and a stage that belongs only to those who earn it honestly. He turned to Grace. And there will be a memorial evening for Evelyn Callahan. If you choose to sing, the invitation is yours. If you choose not to, the respect remains. Grace looked at him, surprised by the second sentence more than the first. The choice. Always the choice. She placed Evelyn's photograph carefully back into his hand. I will ask my mother, she said. Vincent accepted the photograph as if receiving something holy. Outside, Chicago glittered beyond the tall windows, cold and bright. Unaware that inside one quiet restaurant, an entire room had been taught how small cruelty looks when truth finally stands up. Grace walked toward the staff hallway, no tray in her hands, no apology on her lips, while the people who had once looked through her made space without being asked. And that night, the world inside Belladonna remembered what dignity sounds like when it is finally allowed to sing.